Hideo Kojima, a man who many of you would probably know as the guy behind Metal Gear. A guy who some of you might know as the guy behind Zone of the Enders. A guy who a very lucky few of you, which unfortunately does not include me, would know him as the guy behind Police Knots. But I'm about to talk about a game he made that, honestly, I've only met one other person that even knows about it. I'm about to talk about Boktai, The Sun is in Your Hand. Boktai is the story of vampire hunter Django, who sets off to avenge his father's death at the hands of the Count of Ground-Soaking Blood. In order to do this, he's going to need to team up with the Sun Spirit, Master Otanko, travel through many tricky dungeons, outsmart many enemies, navigate various traps, and solve various puzzles, all culminating in his victory over his father's killer. And that's just up to the first boss. Yeah, Boktai's pretty special. Now before we begin our little adventure, let's just take stock of our inventory. You're a vampire hunter, right? So what do you got for weapons? A steak and some garlic, right? No. This is the 21st century. You have a gun that shoots pure, physical, solar energy at your targets. That is the complete and total rundown of your weapons. And I know that seems rather lackluster for equipment to handle a series of undead monstrosities, but trust me, it's enough. The Gun del Sol, your solar gun, is modular. It's made of 4 pieces. A lens, which changes the elements of your gun. The batteries, which store up your energy. A bomb slot, just in case. And finally, and arguably most importantly, the frame. Now the frame is important because it dictates the way your gun will shoot. Your original starting frame will just fire a single shot. But you can find different frames, which will give you spread shots, bullets that can distract enemies. One of them can give you a Zelda-esque hurricane slash. No matter what situation you find yourself in, there will be a gun that suits your occasion. Now before we go on our adventure, we've taken stock of our solar gun, but let's just talk about how we approach combat. Now you can just spray and pray, but you're going to eventually run out of energy, right? Well, it's a solar gun. You can't exactly find ammo laying around. How do you charge it? By walking Django outside of a dungeon, right? Well, not quite. Because this is where that classic Kojima innovation comes in. Boktai came in a clear Game Boy Advance cart. And I know that sounds completely pointless, because pretty much every Game Boy Color cart was clear, right? Well, what's interesting about Boktai's cart is inside its clear cartridge came a small bit of hardware that no other Game Boy Advance cart had. A small little black square. This little square was a solar sensor. So you had to get up, walk outside, shine your cartridge into the sunlight, and charge your gun. And the solar power had much more of effect in-game than just charging your weapon. It affected stuff like weather, enemy patterns, even certain set pieces. While it seems like such a small thing, the sun really was your greatest weapon, for better or worse. The main progression involves going through 2 sets of dungeons, Undead Dungeons and Immortal Dungeons. Undead Dungeons are rather small interstitial areas that will get you from point A to point B. These are your regular areas. Once you complete them, you'll spawn a teleporter which will let you skip the area next time you need to go through. But in between that, you're going to have to navigate passages, stealthing past enemies, as well as looking for treasure to upgrade your weapon. Once you finally finish the area, you'll find yourself locked into a trap room. These are interesting because they're different on every dungeon. It keeps you on your toes. You never know what to expect. Could be a mini-boss, could be a puzzle, could just be trying to survive. Once you make it out of the undead dungeons, you'll find yourself at an immortal dungeon. These are the big, super long ones with bosses. And they're interesting because they take place in 4 phases. The first phase is navigating the dungeon. You have to get to the boss, but in order to do that, you're going to have to go through waves of enemies, solving various puzzles. And it's important to take note of every single thing in the environment, because it does come into play later. Once you've managed to sneak past and or kill everything in your way up to the boss, then we enter the second phase, the boss fight. These are generally lengthy. You have to study your opponent, find their weakness. Sometimes it can be manipulated with the solar sensor. Other times you just have to find their own little intellectual quirks and exploit them. Once you manage to defeat the enemy though, then progression enters stage 3 of the Immortal Dungeons. And this is where things get interesting. Because they're immortal, they were never alive. Therefore, by defeating them, you do not kill them. You simply send them into a resting period inside their coffin. So, in order to get rid of them permanently, you have to purify that coffin. Now how do you do this? With holy water, right? What is this, Castlevania? No. You take it to the pile driver, a series of large solar lasers that disintegrate the monster inside. But the trick is that you have to carry the coffin all the way through the dungeon back to the entrance to do so. Now this effectively doubles gameplay length, and this is padding, certainly, but it's a whole different experience. Yes, you have to retread the same dungeon, but you have to do it differently, as you have to carry this coffin all the way down. Now this doesn't sound too bad, but you're a lot slower and you're a lot louder, which means you're going to attract more enemies. Your initial thought would probably be simply to just shoot all the enemies and go back for the coffin, right? Well, that doesn't quite work. If you leave the coffin for any amount of time, the immortal inside will start clawing their way back up to their chambers, meaning you have to go back and get them again. If that weren't enough, they're also prone to attacking you, which means you have to babysit this coffin while stealthing around, avoiding all sorts of monsters from discovering you, all while this coffin is attacking you, and while solving puzzles, hoping the immortal inside doesn't crawl away. And sometimes, the trek back actually has to be approached differently, simply because you're carrying a coffin. So while it is padding, it's a different experience altogether. And I think hammers home that this is in fact a stealth horror game of sorts. Now once you finally drag the Immortal's coffin back to the entrance, you activate the pile driver. This is done once again by absorbing as much sunlight as you possibly can and weaponizing it. And this enters a secondary boss fight of sorts, where the remains of the Immortal will try and attack the pile driver and Django in hopes to stop the purification process. If they succeed, they'll start crawling their way back, and you'll have to start this phase all over again. Fortunately, you can slow them down by attacking them while the pile driver tries to finish them off. Once you finish off the Immortal, you can move on, because there's many more out there haunting the City of Death, and you're the only one who can stop it. The soundtrack is 2 parts suspenseful horror, 1 part western, and I know that sounds like a weird kind of combination for a soundtrack, but it really does work. And everything has a sort of hand-drawn aesthetic. It looks like a lot of care and attention was put into giving all the characters and monsters a personality just by how they're drawn, and how they move, and how they detect you, because their senses are all just a little bit different. You have to constantly be thinking of your new approach. If you're going up against random zombies, or mummies, or those stupid-ass crows, or golems which can actually be used to attack other opponents for you. As much as I love Boktai, I have 2 problems with it. First of all, as innovative and cool as the solar sensor is, you can't play the game without it. This means if you're living in the far-flung future where you're all underground mole people because the sun exploded and we all somehow survived, your cartridges are going to be kind of worthless. Or, on a much more realistic current problem, if you have a high sensitivity to sunlight, you probably shouldn't be playing this. My second biggest problem is that this game wasn't very popular. Don't take that the wrong way, I'm not trying to be a sort of hipster douche or anything, no. The problem with that is that there was an optional dungeon. And you know, that's cool. In order to progress through this dungeon, you need to get several keys. Again, no real problems. The problem comes from the fact that each individual Boktai game card came with 1 key, and in order to get all the keys to finish the dungeon, you had to link up with a series of other Boktai game cards, all hopefully having a different key than you. And they were unique to each cartridge, so you had to get very lucky and hopefully have a lot of friends that had this game, which in North America really didn't happen. This meant you couldn't complete the game as a specific frame was locked out along with a boss fight, and that's kind of annoying. And I think that's the sad thing about Boktai. It was thoroughly unpopular for all its innovation, and that seems to be a common theme. Awesome games like Psychonauts, Okami, God Hand, they just weren't picked up en masse, and unfortunately, I think a lot of creativity and innovation died with them. But the interesting thing about Boktai was, it only sold poorly in America, and I, being the jaded person I am, blame people who don't want to get off their ass and go out in the sun to play their video games, which is a shame because a vampire hunter who needs to use sunlight as his weapon would be about as immersive as possible. But the funny thing is, it was quite popular in Japan. In fact, it was popular enough to spawn a sequel, Boktai 2, which Konami also took a gamble with and released it in North America, and it fell flat on its face. However, it still sold well enough in Japan that they made a third one, which we did not get, and I am bitter as all hell about that, but it makes sense. There was also a fourth one on the DS, which went by the name Lunar Nights, probably to distance itself from the lack of success the series has, and that did actually get a release in North America. And it was alright. But that's Boktai, a game I'm probably going to continue playing until Konami finally releases an English version of Boktai 3 for me. Damn it.
Keep the sun always in your heart.